I am thrilled to welcome back Rabbi Lauren Tuchman, who is a friend of La Asok. Rabbi Tuchman, you've taught for us 2 or 3 times now, so I think we can call you a friend of La Asok at this point. She is a rabbi and teacher based in the Washington, D.C. area. She teaches text, as we'll see today. She teaches on a variety of topics, and she also leads Jewish mindfulness as a second area in which she is a real thought leader in the Jewish world. At the top of the chat, you'll see Rabbi Tuchman's Substack, ways to get in touch with her and ways to hear from her on a regular basis. I happen to be on her mailing list and I get her Divrei Torah, and they are wonderful, so I highly recommend that. I am going to share my screen so we can say the blessing for study together, and then I'll turn things right over to Rabbi Tuchman for our discussion. Please join me if you'd like to unmute so that we can hear one another saying the blessing, then now is a good time to do that. And let's say together, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu v'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed is the Eternal, whose mitzvot, whose commandments make our lives holy, and who commands us to immerse, to engage in words of Torah. Rabbi Lauren Tuchman, take it away.
Thank you so much. And I for sure am a friend of Last Silk. I'm so grateful to be back with all of you, and particularly really grateful to be offering a few words on a pre-Shavuot theme for Tikva through text. So thank you so much again for having me with you all today. I wanted to talk a little bit about Shavuot, which is coming up imminently in a couple of days. And one of the ideas that the rabbis really bring to this holiday, which is found nowhere in the Torah, it's really a rabbinic addition, um, but it's the notion of Shavuot being Zman Matan Toratenu, the time of the giving of our Torah. That's how Shavuot gets referred to in the liturgy, even though Shavuot is an agricultural holiday originally. It was the time of the wheat harvest. So we had to figure out a way to make Shavuot relevant to our lives after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, after the destruction of the second temple, because we weren't able to bring the Omer offering anymore, and we weren't able to observe the wheat harvest. So what exactly were we going to do with this day? And that's where the idea of it becoming correlated to the day in which all Jews stood at Mount Sinai to receive Torah. So many, many years ago now, I delivered what is known as an Eli talk, and I will honestly say I forgot what Eli stands for. It's an acronym, but I delivered an Eli talk. They're often known as the Jewish TED Talk, entitled "We All Were at Sinai: The Transformative Power of Inclusive Torah." My theology and understanding of this work has evolved in some ways, but I am still very deeply rooted in the talk and in its primary goal, which is to think about inclusion of Jews, specifically with disabilities, because that's my primary focus, but also of all kinds of Jews and all kinds of different identity categories across the North American community in Jewish life. We should think about that in terms of revelation rather than thinking about it in terms of because we were once strangers, we should be inclusive towards all who might feel like strangers in our communities. And the reason that I wanted to change the anchor of the commandment I believe that exists for us to be as inclusive as possible is because we're not strangers. We want to be included in our spiritual communities, but we're not the them. We're part of the us. That was really the main idea in that talk. And I just wanted to share a little bit of text that supports that and helps us think broadly about what does it mean that we all stood at Sinai as a collective to receive Torah. So I want to invite you, I know it's been shared, to look at the Safaria source sheet. I'll be speaking for a couple of minutes now, and then we're going to go. Thank you so much for screen sharing. We're going to go ahead and open it up for some conversation after I share a little bit. Note that I am not going to read the texts directly, but I'm going to reference them. So you have the source sheet available if you would like to access that now or later as you wish. There's a very famous midrashic idea that all Jews were as one at Sinai. Often the term is all Jews stood together at Sinai. I like to think of all Jews were as one at Sinai because we know that though most of us stand, many people do not. And so I want to be inclusive in my language. We all were as one at Sinai, but yet, according to the Midrash, we received Torah in a way that we individually could understand. So there's really a paradox here, right? On the one hand, the claim, which I think is a really beautifully audacious claim, is that we all were together across every kind of difference imaginable and across differences around geography, around time, all of these things, the everything kind of collapsed, and every person who would ever be part of the Jewish community, past, present, and future, every single one of us was there. And we were all there together, so just this incalculable number of souls. And simultaneously, we all heard revelation. Ani Adonai Elohecha, we all heard that revelation in a way that we could understand it. So the Torah then has 70 faces, which the rabbis, they love to use the term 70 faces as a way of talking about infinity. That's like the rabbinic understanding of infinity. And so therefore, Torah has an infinite number of voices that can be heard and an infinite number of interpretations. And if those things are true, well, then how more so is it true that we get to be part of that interpretive tradition? And we, by virtue of being who we are, by virtue of having the experiences that we have in our lives, have lived experience that enriches Torah. That Torah becomes even more alive when we bring our full reason to it, when we bring our full selves and all of the knowledge that we have, because all of that knowledge ultimately is meant for us to use and meant for us to use in ways of making the world a better and safer and more equitable place for everyone, especially in the world that we find ourselves in now. This is more important. This countercultural message is more important than ever. So I really root my idea of thinking about we all were at Sinai in this midrash. And midrash, really briefly, is rabbinic exegesis, which I recognize is not always a helpful definition. Midrash comes from the Hebrew root dalid resh shin lidrosh, to search out or to interpret. Some people think that midrashim, the plural of midrash, were originally sermons. So if you think about like being in temple or in synagogue these days, and whomever it is gives the Dar Torah, some people think that midrashim were the earliest iteration of that. Regardless, these are rabbinic ways of playing with text. It's really actually quite beautiful the ways that the rabbis use their imagination to think about text and to inspire people to become more connected, which is really what we're doing here. And so, where is the tikva in this, right? The tikva in this is the notion that every single one of us has, as the rabbis say, our own portion in Torah. That every single one of us has that unique portion because we were all there and we all received revelation in a way that we could understand it. So it's interesting, paradoxically, because revelation was both singular and collective. We received Torah, and simultaneously, we received that Torah in a way that was understandable to us. So we get to hold that kind of paradox of collective reception and individual comprehension. But I think one of the unique things about the Jewish tradition, Moshe, Moses, is understood by the Rambam and by many others as the Jewish tradition's greatest and, of course, greatest prophet who will not be, we will not have a prophet like Moses again, according to the Rambam, famously. And the Rambam is Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, also known as Maimonides. Um, but the Jewish tradition is one that privileges, that really centers the people, right? The people were there. We aren't reliant upon Moses to hear Torah. Although it should also be said that very soon after the revelation itself, the people kind of freak out and they're like, this is way too much. Like, there's all this like synesthetic stuff happening. There's all this stuff happening. Moses, can you go up the mountain and get it for us and bring it down? Because this is a lot. I don't think that's what the Torah actually wanted. The Torah wanted the people to be there and to actually receive it themselves rather than having it intermediated through Moses. So that's one important piece of like the foundation of my theology around inclusion. And around really just allowing all of Torah to be brought into our communities. For us as modern liberal Jews to think about, what is the knowledge that we have? What are the lived experiences that we have that we can bring to making Torah even richer? And so I wanted to just really focus there. I have a couple of examples on the source sheet of ways in which that happened. I'll talk about one of those in particular right now because it was recently Passover. It's hard to believe, even though it was over a month ago now. There were a number of sages in the Babylonian Talmud who were fully blind. And the Talmud has a lot to say about that. And which I am someone who's particularly interested in that as somebody who also is fully blind. One of the things that comes up around the particular sages, there's one named Rav Yosef and one named Rav Sheshet, both of whom are from something called the Amoraic period, which basically means that they were part of the rabbis who compiled the Gemara as we have it, and specifically the Babylonian Talmud. So that's really important to note. There is an incident in the 10th chapter. This may be a little bit further down on the source sheet. It's Psachim 116a and b is what I'm going to briefly reference. And then we'll go down after I speak through this text. We'll open it up for some discussion. So if you look at Sachim 116a and b, it should be on there. I'm so sorry I don't recall which source number it is, but I'll say briefly that there is a technicality. I won't go into all of the like nitty-gritty of the technicality, but on Passover, we have an obligation according to the rabbis, and folks may be familiar with this, that Rabban Gamliel says if you haven't fulfilled these three things, then you haven't fulfilled your obligation for the Seder. And what are they? Pasach, Matzah, Umaror, right? The Pasach, the Matzah, and the Maror. Now, technically, to fulfill that obligation, and again, I'm inviting all of us to just hear this, and I'm inviting all of us to just be with this and not take it literally. You're supposed to point, right? To show, like, Pesach, al shum ha, Pesach, like on account of what? And so one of the rabbis says, well, but can a blind person then lead the Seder because they can't point to Pesach and the Matzah and the Maror? So the disciples of Rav Sheshet and the disciples of Rav Yosef say, well, in the houses of Rav Sheshet and Rav Yosef, they're leading the Seder. So again, Rav Sheshet and Rav Yosef are both fully blind. And so if they're able to do that, your rabbinic objection notwithstanding, I think there's no problem with a blind person leading the Seder. And you might think to yourself, like, okay, that's nice, that's fine. I'm glad that the, students of these two rabbinic greats stood up for their teachers. Fine. That seems like a pretty inconsequential thing. However, I think it's really important to say that part of this is, I think, rooted back in the idea that everyone has their own portion in Torah. Because Rav Sheshet and Rav Yosef are just sitting over there being like, well, can't point. so I'm not going to lead the Seder. They're like, this doesn't make any sense. I want to be part of this. This is important to me. Like, I'm going to do what I need to do to be part of this. And I think that particular perspective is extraordinarily important as we are thinking about Judaism in our time. The idea of, I have knowledge, I have an embodied understanding of something that someone else may not. And that embodied understanding, that lived experience, then is going to influence, awesome, perfect. Is going to influence then how I show up and how I think about Torah and what insights I can offer. So I want to just end by encouraging us to, on the one hand, as somebody really powerfully said at a rabbinic day of learning I attended yesterday, have a little bit of rahmanas on the Torah, meaning having a little bit of compassion for the Torah in its own context, not having the kind of language that we might wish it to have. Simultaneously to that, recognizing that part of being in relationship with Torah is bringing our own highlight our own portion into that. So I want to pause there and open it up for discussion. And just to end and say, that's where I find a lot of hope, right? Is that we are actively co creating. We are actively co creating and continuing on the receiving of Torah and the teaching of Torah. So I'll turn it back over.
Amazing. If you have thoughts to share, the best thing to do, friends, is to raise your hand electronically, and then I will be able to call on you. And while people are thinking through that, Rabbi Tuchman, is it okay if I respond to what you're saying by something
Yeah,
I've been thinking about? I
absolutely.
so I was writing my article for the La Asok newsletter that'll come out next Wednesday. So those of you who are on the newsletter will read what I'm about to talk about next Wednesday when it comes out. But I often think about Jewish study as a sort of a multi-generational conversation between the Jews, right? When we read our text, we read what our ancestors had to say, and we contribute to that conversation by being here. And what you were saying made me think about Revelation. We talk about Revelation as something we receive, right? We talk about Kabbalat Torah, the receiving of Torah, receiving of revelation. But I wonder if it's actually more two-way than that. I wonder what you're describing, which really is this central Jewish idea, is that Torah is not just something we get from heaven. Torah is something that we create together as a people, which of course is why inclusiveness is important, because everybody's lived and embodied experience contributes to what Torah is. So, I mean, if Torah is this multi-generational conversation, then I think all the more so it's important that we're all there, because Torah, in the larger, the capital tough sense, right? The sense of being the Jewish textual tradition is what we make of it. And therefore, if anybody's experience is missing, then Torah is deficient, so to speak. It's not what it could have been.
Yeah, exactly. Right, exactly. And I think that's it. Because we all received it. And therefore, the idea that Torah can only speak to some of us is just profoundly misaligned, I think, with what you're describing and what I'm describing. Which it also means, though, it actually affords us quite a tremendous responsibility, which I feel really excited and also very overwhelmed by at times, particularly as liberal Jews, however we sort of situate ourselves in that large umbrella. We have an obligation to teach the Torah that we have, right? We have an obligation to bring that into the world and to trust that our Torah is authentic and rooted and deeply part and parcel of tradition. That I think is really important because, as you say, we're not only receiving it from heaven, as it says later in Deuteronomy, very famously, one of my favorite psukim, it's not in heaven or across the sea. This is a paraphrase. It's not heaven in heaven or across the sea or too far away so that you can say, "Oh, but I can't go and get it." No, it's right here. It's in your mouth to do it. It's so close to you. It's right here. So, at times, especially when it feels like we don't have a voice or it feels like ours is a silenced voice, like we, I think, have an obligation to put our Torah out there because you never know who you're going to impact. And it's really important to remember that we have Torah worth hearing.
Amazing. We have a hand up from Mark. Mark, please.
Well, I just want to repeat an idea that I got from Rabbi Michael Lerner, who used to always talk about that even Moshe only receives the Torah that he can understand in his own manner. And he used to cite examples of, you know, I guess there's one where Hashem says, this is how you prepare the people for receiving the Torah. And Moses comes down and says, okay, do this, do this, do this. Also, don't touch your wives. There's no sex involved. Well, that's not a part of what Hashem said to him. And so Michael used to use that as an example that even Moshe is limited by how he takes in the information and how what he says through his mouth is based on his own life experience and his own interpretation. So we have to apply this same rule. I think this is a wonderful part of our tradition, but it applies to all our sages. They all receive and give out what they can with the tools they have.
Exactly. Yes, and that's a wonderful example of that, which we will actually see on Shavuot because it's part of the liturgy. Yes, that's a really good example. And that example that you name around, Moses saying, and don't go near a woman, right? And that's not actually what Moses received, but that itself has been used to really marginalize women. And this was many decades ago now, but Judith Plaskow, in her Standing Again at Sinai, um, really talks about that. Merle Feld has a really beautiful poem that I try to read every Shavuot. I am completely blanking on the title of it, but it carries a very, very similar idea, right, that you mentioned. And I think that Rabbi Lerner is correct to say that every single one of our sages, including us, right, we are all deeply limited by our own life experience, and we have the tools that we have, and so part of it is just like this radical anava, this radical humility, which in Judaism, in a Jewish context, means that we are aware of what we do and what we don't know. It is not about shrinking ourselves and being small. It's about being right-sized, right? So as the Musar tradition says, right, it's about showing up in a right-sized way, knowing where our lane is, right? Not being self-abdicating, but knowing where our lane is. And I think that that's exactly it, of recognizing that our sages, just like we are, limited by our and their life experience. And still, what they say is valuable. And we continue that conversation, and we do so with, I think, a lot of humility and a lot of honor, but also recognizing, like, yeah, there's a lot that we have that they didn't. And in a century from now, like, the sages that come after us will say the same thing.
We have a comment in the chat from Adam. Adam, do you want me to read it, or would you like to unmute and say your thought?
I can try to explain it. The Agadah, well, the materials that you presented sort of reminded me of the problem of like whether women are obligated to mitzvah, to positive time-bound mitzvot, and the part saying that, someone who does a mitzvah that's commanded to do it is sort of higher than one who isn't commanded to do it. And so it's that kind of introduces this hierarchy into the tradition where the fact that women are exempted from this obligation actually makes women lower. But then the way I read the Agadah of Yehuda Hanasi, who chooses to show respect to the blind person, and we also see in the other sources that the blind person is sort of, there's a debate about whether someone who's blind is being obligated as well, similar to women. In this case, the fact that he respects that person means that he gets a blessing. And there's a kind of inversion of it says, you know, the one who does not see, sorry, one who is seen but does not see sort of ends up being the image of the one who sees but is not seen. So there's like this inversion where what seems like is a lower position there becomes actually the image of the highest position of God. So I wonder if like that would be a way to read, you know, this question of egalitarianism as well, you know, of obligating women to mitzvot, because you know the tradition isn't frozen in that sense. It has all of these playful kind of inversions within it.
Thanks, Adam. I'm
Yeah.
going to call on Lauren. Oh, sorry, Rabbi Tuchman. We have one more comment, and then do you
Oh,
want me to
please, we'll
respond
take,
to both?
yeah, absolutely.
So we have Lauren Davis, and then we'll hand it back over to Rabbi Tuchman for a final thought.
Rabbi Tuchman, I think you've opened up the conversation to all ends of the spectrum of liberal Judaism. I think one of our obligations, in addition to understanding the Torah, is to read it and to read the Torah and its commentary, because the rabbis have interpreted this over a period of time in such different manners. There's such discussion, such dynamic observation of what's going on. So I think the contemporary Jews, whether one believes in revelation or not, by reading the code of what the Torah embraces and its interpretation, brings us into the obligation of understanding it and then transforming it into our own lifestyle. And I think that's the connection. We have to read it first. We have to understand the various points of view, and then we can interpret it as we understand Judaism. So I think your discussion today is a very inclusive discussion, and I really embrace what you're saying.
Yeah, thank you so much to both of you. I'll just say in brief, yes, absolutely. I think a through line for both of those comments, right, is that we are really obligated to read and understand the commentary. And I think that's key. I think it's really important. If there's one thing that I would love for all of us to be doing this year on Shavuot, is to really be reading our text directly, and understanding how our tradition has interpreted it, and really beginning to take ownership of our tradition. I think that liberal Jews, I just would love it if more and more of us did that across, as you say, the spectrum of what it means to be a liberal Jew today, right? And there are lots of different variety that we have. But I would be so grateful and delighted if that's something that we did and took this really seriously and stood firm in that. And so I'll end by just noting that the question of egalitarianism is one that I am very passionate about and have thought a lot about. But I would recommend, I mean, I know that different Jewish denominations within the egalitarian framework, right? Because we are very lucky to have a robust egalitarianism in North America. But I would recommend, if people are interested in kind of thinking about the sources, Rabbi Pamela Barnash wrote a very extensive paper for the Conservative Movement's Committee on Jewish Law and Standards in 2014, which officially obligates women in mitzvot and goes into lots of detail, even though plenty of women were obligating in mitzvot way before that, but this was sort of a way of like putting that out there. So that's something that I would really recommend to anyone who's interested in that. And I will turn it back over.
Wonderful. Let me say a huge thank you to Rabbi Lauren Tuchman for this really uplifting and hopeful teaching, and to all of you for being here. Next week actually dovetails nicely with what we've been talking about today. We're going to be studying with Rabbi Emma Gottlieb, who has taught this class before as well, who will be teaching about what we're calling the uniqueness of you. She's going to be quoting Martin Buber, among other sources. So a little bit more modern source, but connecting nicely with the idea of inclusiveness like we talked about today. So I'll wish you all a Chag Shavuot Sameach, a very happy Shavuot. I wish you good learning and good cheesecake and a happy holiday. And we'll see you next week. Take care, everyone.